So he says in order to produce good work, you can't simply just go off and produce whatever that you want to. If you're going to be of lasting significance, gimmicks, novelties, the latest fad, the latest craze is not going to allow you to produce anything of lasting worth. What you've got to do is mediate your individual talent, if you have any at all, through the work of previous writers. And the word that we use for those works which have stood the test of time and which say something not merely about the specific time and place where they were created. Any work, is going to bear some trace of the time and place, but those aren't the things that are going to make the piece of enduring worth. What's going to make the piece of enduring worth is that it seems to speak to issues. It seems to arouse affective responses from the audience which are universal and which speak for all of humanity. And these are the things that Eliot will call traditional. And these are the things that we would ourselves now call canonical. So the canon is going to be what? That collection of books which, no matter where they were made, no matter when they were made, somehow tap into the spirit of humanity in such a way that they seem to speak for the entire race. And these are the things that we call classics, and we collect them in the canon. The canon, if you are a churchgoer of some type, that you'll know that there's this thing called the canon of Scripture. So all kinds of letters, all kinds of epistles, all kinds of revelations, all kinds of Gospels were written in the early Christian church, and they're all out there to be read, or at least those that we've found. But out of all of the letters that were written, out of all of the accounts of the life of Jesus, out of all of the revelations which were written down, it's this particular group which are considered to be a standard against which all belief, against which all practice, and against which all other writings should be judged. So canon is it's a word which literally means rule or standard. So in the Christian tradition, there is the canonical books of the Bible. Doesn't mean you can't read the other things, but if you're mainstream Christian, then you're going to say these books are canon, and whatever else we read, we need to take it with a grain of salt and see how it measures up to these standard works. In literature, it's the same thing, only they're not sacred writings, they're secular writings. But there's a collection of classic texts going all the way back to Homer up to the present date, which have been estimated both by the general public, but in particular by critics, as the books which have stood the test of time, which transcend the particular conditions under which they were written, and that represent either the human spirit in general, or if you are thinking of a particular nation or a particular language, which captures the essence of that particular culture or people. This is what we call the canon, and what Eliot's going to be suggesting in his writings is that we need to become more familiar with the canon and its familiarity with the canon, which is going to enable us to produce in modern times works that speak as powerfully to us as any of the classics. So that's where he's going with this. So he'll use the word tradition to refer to that body of works which have pride of place in the library, and which everybody, if they want to consider themselves educated and respectable, ought to have read. And, everybody, someone in their family's got on some shelf somewhere, an entire row of books, all bound in leather with probably titles and authors' names embossed on the spine in gold. And, nobody reads these things, but everybody is expected, if, again, they're going to pretend to be educated and respectable, everybody's expected to have read these. So the works of Shakespeare, the works of Geoffrey Chaucer. In the American literary canon, everybody's expected to have read Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter. Everybody's expected, not that everybody has, but everybody's expected to read Herman Melville, Moby Dick. Everybody's expected to have read The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. These are part of the literary canon. Is the canon definitive? No, Eliot is quite clear that the canon is in a state of constant flux. It's not wild flux, but anytime something of genuine quality comes into the world for the first time, it will be read, received, and judged according to the way that it fits in with the canon. And he says all of the books in the canon form a kind of a constellation. And each time a new book enters into relationship with all of the other books, everything else has to shift just a little bit. So we may read The Sound and the Fury or Absalom, Absalom by William Faulkner and understand these to be tremendous writings of lasting significance, expressive either of the human spirit in general or of the American character. Then Toni Morrison comes along and writes Beloved. Interesting book in that it's written very much in the style of William Faulkner, but it's looking at the same culture of the American South, either before, during, or just after the Civil War, and it's seeing them from a very, very different perspective. Toni Morrison's book goes on to be considered one of the greatest books of the 20th century. Definitely her masterpiece, and yet is it completely original? No, she's done something different, but she's done it in a way that shows her deep familiarity with other writers, and in particular William Faulkner. And as Eliot says, it may well be the case that the very finest passages in Toni Morrison's Beloved are the ones where she most seems to be writing as if she were William Faulkner. Having read a new addition to the canon, everything else looks a little bit different to us. We can't read Faulkner in the same way anymore. It's not like he's an entirely different author, but he sounds different to us. He feels different to us now that we've read Toni Morrison. So this is what this is what Eliot's getting at with tradition. He distinguishes, though, between tradition and history He says everybody, if they want to be taken seriously as a writer, and he says beyond, if they want to be considered a poet, and if they want to produce any kind of worthy poetry beyond their 25th year, they've got to have a historical sense. But two words which we might see as identical, history and tradition, Eliot's going to want to see in opposition to one another. Tradition is going to be anything we would put into the library and say this, magazines will come and go, and paperbacks will come and go. They're a dime a dozen. That's why there's a TV show called Penny Dreadful. Books that are meant to give you, thrills and chills for an evening or, at most a week. And then you're never going to read it again. You're probably not even going to keep it. You're going to donate it to the library or just throw it away. And then there's those books which last for all time. There's a literary canon. There's a canon of visual arts. Those, their illustrations come and go, cartoons come and go, but there are these paintings, there are these sculptures which we are going to keep in the Louvre, or we're going to keep in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and they're seen as part of our common human heritage. And there's also a musical canon too. It's redonkulously limited in terms of where and when the music was produced, and this has created a lot of controversy lately, but Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, all part of this German classical music tradition. That's the musical canon, and people have quite rightly begun to question whether it's possible that almost all of the music which we consider to be of transcendent quality happens to come from a single language group and seems to come from a very, very small part of the world and within a very narrow interval of time, a very brief interval of time. There's canon creation and canon revision, but Eliot's leaping into this debate saying, look, what we need to do is a little housekeeping. We need to get in touch with the things that we keep lying around our museums, get in touch with the type of music which is being performed at our symphony halls, and start curating, though I hate to use that word because you hear it everywhere now, it's ubiquitous, but curating our canons, taking care of them, and in the process taking care of our cultural life. So again, that's tradition. What's history then? History is all of the little incidentals surrounding the creation of a work of art that allow us to identify it as coming from this time or this place. So in a way, what history might be is footnotes. You see an unfamiliar name in a work like the one that we're reading, and what do you immediately want to do? Go down to the bottom of the page and look at the footnotes and figure out who Southey was, or somebody like that you've never heard of before. Or, if there's no footnote, then what do we love to do? We love to go to Wikipedia or some other information source and get all kinds of incidental pieces of background information. And what Eliot wants to say, look, history's interesting, but history is what gets lost. History is what doesn't make it into the museum, and tradition is what does make it into the museum. So there's nothing wrong with studying history, but we do not read literature to learn, as far as Eliot's concerned, about how people used to live and dress and think in Elizabethan England. We read poetry from Elizabethan England or from Attic Greece, not for all of the local color, but rather for those things which transcend the local culture. So again, history's not a bad thing, but it's not what you're looking for in literature. And of the two, tradition, Eliot's going to, throughout his essay, come up with a variety of what we might call dichotomous pairs, and he's always going to do what? Value one over the other. So in this case, tradition versus history, which is more important? Tradition by far. Yeah, it might be fun to know all of the little local details about John Milton or Sir Philip Sidney or somebody like that, but that's not what we read literature for. We read literature to get in touch with certain affective states and with certain ways of using the language which speak to all people in all times and places. Do you agree with this? You don't need to agree with it. You just need to see that this is what Eliot is saying, and in addition to that, you need to find it interesting. So this is something that I wrote earlier today to one of you out there. One of the hardest things to learn in college, but one of the most important things to learn in college, is that you can read a piece of writing by somebody with whom you do not agree at all, or about whom you have serious reservations, and nevertheless still find that reading to be incredibly interesting and extremely worthwhile. Simply to read only what you like and agree with, one, it's not only an incomplete education, but frankly, it's not fun. There's so much great writing out there which contains all kinds of ideas which, to my mind, are simply erroneous, but it's so fun to see the crazy places that people are able to go with their minds and with the materials they use. And, if you only stick to what seems familiar, agreeable, and correct, you're really cheating yourself out of a lot of things. So, again, you don't have to agree with Eliot, but I think you do want to try to enjoy him as much as possible. That said, I'm going to move on now to him talking about the dead. Just in case you were wondering where that, by some people beloved movie, Dead Poet Society, gets its name, this is it. The society isn't a bunch of kids at some boarding school wearing serge blazers with some type of a crest sewn on to the breast of it. The Dead Poet Society is going to be that community of people who have written going all the way back to Homer, who live in society with themselves and with whom we can commune even though they're dead and we're alive. And the way that we commune with them is, one, through reading them, but also through writing our own new works. But our own new works are going to be successful to the extent that they are not examples of our attempt to express ourselves earnestly, directly, and immediately to our living readers the way that Wordsworth wanted, but our works are going to be viewed as successful and of lasting worth if they are rather attempts to communicate or to commune with all of the dead writers of the past. That's where the relationship is. Everybody alive is free to read the poet communing with the society of the dead poets, but that's not who's being directly addressed. It's the dead who are being addressed. And just moving a little bit along here, I'll come back to that idea, but one of the things that Eliot's going to say is art never improves. Well, what do you mean art never improves? Well, way back in the day, they hadn't even invented oil paints yet. And now look what we can do, that not only do we have oil paints, but we've got factory produced, but it's so much easier. And look at the more realistic effects that we can achieve. Now there's a thing called the airbrush. Of course art improves. And Ellie says, no, it does not. The quality of art going all the way back to the beginning and the quality of art going all the way to the present moment, art never gets better. Art changes, but the excellence which is achieved by the finest and most representative artists of the day, what we're doing now is just as good as what they were doing thousands of years ago, or what they were doing thousands of years ago is just as good as what we're doing today. What changes is not the general quality of work, but what changes is the tools and techniques that we use to create the work. And so what we really want to do is try to conjure up, if we can, the same types of affective states that earlier generations were able to conjure in their day, though the difference will be we can't simply do what? Borrow their techniques and borrow their technologies. We have to create art with our own technologies and find ways to use our own technologies to create art which is every bit as powerful and compelling as that which was produced hundreds or thousands of years ago. So art changes, but the level of quality never changes. What changes, again, is the way that the art is an expression of and an exploration of the technological conditions under which we're living. So that said, well, how far back does this go? And it's interesting. Eliot's going to say the art which he's willing to include in the tradition and which he considers to be every bit as representative of humanity as Shakespeare or the greatest writer in the 21st century, whoever that will be when we finally get around to deciding that. You know, how far back can you go and still find quality art? And he'll refer to the Magdalenian draftsmen. Well, these are the cave painters whose work goes back 30 to 40,000 years ago. Art has never gotten any better than that. It's never gotten necessarily any worse than that. It's just changed. They had what? Berry juice and a straw that they could use to spray images on the wall. And, you know, Shakespeare, or I'll just stick with the visual imagery, Leonardo had oil paints. Monet had factory manufactured oil paint, and Andy Warhol had screen printing and photography. None of this work is either better or worse in quality, but what makes these artists great, whether we know their names or not, is the fact that they were able to conjure up the human essence in terms of the instruments, the technologies, the material world in which they lived at that particular time. So 40,000 years ago, art's never gotten any better since then. And as a matter of fact, when they first started finding these cave paintings and exploring them earlier in the 20th century, one of the first people to go down there and have a look at it was a guy named Pablo Picasso. He descends into the caves of Lascaux to see all of the cave bear paintings and the reindeers on the wall and stuff like that. He comes out, he's like, we've learned nothing. Nothing's gotten any better since then. They were every bit as good as we are. But here's an interesting thing. You know, in those caves, what do you think they were doing? Why did they make that art at all? And the answer is they were trying in one way or another. Now, I'm not an archaeologist, but I'll give you at least Eliot's answer to that question. Why were they making this art? Because they were trying to do what? Commune with and gain a measure of control over the most powerful and mysterious forces that there were, which is life and death, procreation and killing. And the art was used as a form of magic that would empower either the person making it or that was made through the magical powers possessed by the artists themselves. And then those images were used to do what? To get people worked up into some type of an exalted state, which would prepare them to make love or make war or deal with the death of somebody. They're using the art to do what? To conjure the dead. Those are religious paintings down there, and they are meant to do what? Grant us some type of supernatural access to and communion with the dead. And what Eliot is suggesting in 1919, and I think this is so fascinating, we're still doing the same thing right now. He talks about, any artist who wants to produce something good has to do it by entering into a different state of mind. You could even say an altered state of mind, such that through the technical means available in any given person's time and place, that they're able to use these to conjure up the souls of the dead, and in that fashion to commune with them and to maintain our connection with our ancestors. They may be dead, but they're still living in society to us. And in order for us to be able to maintain our social relations with our dead ancestors, we need artists. And that's what the poet has to do in the 20th century. He just can't do it with berry juice anymore, or, even if the pen is mightier than the sword, the pen's not enough to do it right now because we've got technologies which supersede that. One of them might be the typewriter. So if you're listening to a Prokofiev piece of music and it sounds like he's typing, not playing on the piano, there's a reason for that.